Alright, bosses, grab your gold-plated coffee mugs and settle in. Welcome back to Boss Economics World, the only channel that tells you what the talking heads on cable news are too scared or too clueless to admit. Today, we're diving headfirst into a story that's about to shake the global financial system like a cheap snow globe in an earthquake. You saw the headlines on September 4, 2025. President Trump, back in the Oval Office, is playing his greatest hits. He's taking his tariff magnum opus to the Supreme Court, asking the 9 robed figures in Washington to grant him the economic equivalent of the infinity gauntlet. We're talking about a case that could redefine presidential power, vaporize trillions in global trade, and make your stock portfolio do a backflip. So, what's the big deal? The news reports are full of legal jargon: 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act, Solicitor General, fast-track schedule. It's designed to make your eyes glaze over. But here at Boss Economics World, we don't do jargon. We do the truth. And the truth is, this isn't just a legal squabble. This is the final boss battle for the soul of the global economy. Let's peel back the onion, layer by painful layer, from the courtroom drama to the catastrophic economic shockwaves this could unleash. First, let's get the legal nonsense out of the way, so we can get to the juicy economic meat. The whole case hinges on a 1977 law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA. This law was designed for real emergencies. Think, a hostile nation is about to nuke a city, and the president needs to freeze their assets right now. It gives the president the power to regulate financial transactions and property during a declared national emergency. Now, Trump's administration has performed a spectacular feat of linguistic gymnastics. They've declared that a trade deficit, something the US has had for most of the last 50 years, is an unusual and extraordinary threat. And they've argued that the word regulate in the IEPA gives the president the power to impose massive, sweeping tariffs on virtually all imports. The lower courts, including the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, took one look at this and, in a rare moment of judicial clarity, said, absolutely not. Their reasoning was simple: the Constitution explicitly gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. It's right there in Article 1, Section 8. Handing that power over to the president requires a crystal clear, unambiguous law from Congress. The IEPA, they argued, is about freezing assets and blocking transactions, not inventing a multi-trillion-dollar tax regime out of thin air. To put it in terms a 5-year-old can understand, it's like your dad giving you permission to regulate your little brother's cookie intake to prevent a tummy ache, and you interpreting that as the authority to set up a toll booth in the kitchen and charge him $5 per cookie. It's a laughable abuse of the original intent. But now, Trump is betting the farm on a conservative-leaning Supreme Court to say, you know what? The kitchen toll booth sounds like a great idea. If the court agrees, it effectively transfers the single most powerful tool of economic policy, the power to tax foreign trade, from the 535 members of Congress to one man in the Oval Office. The economic implications are staggering. This is where we leave the courtroom and enter the real world, your world, my world, the world of balance sheets and P&L statements. If the Supreme Court sides with Trump, or even if the uncertainty drags on, we're not just looking at a policy shift. We're looking at a systemic shock. Layer 1, the surface-level tsunami: your wallet gets lighter. Let's talk numbers. The article mentions a current U.S. effective tariff rate of 16.3%. Bosses, you need to understand how insane that number is. For decades leading up to 2018, the average U.S. tariff rate was around 2 to 3%. We are currently living in the most protectionist American economy in over a century, dwarfing everything since the infamous 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act that deepened the Great Depression. A victory for Trump at the Supreme Court would cement the 16.3% rate, or higher, as the new normal. So, what does that mean? Inflation on steroids: a tariff is a tax. Period. It's not paid by China or Mexico or Germany. It's paid by the American importer, like Target or Ford, who then passes that cost directly on to you, the consumer. Numerous studies on the 2018 to 2019 tariffs confirmed this. A 2019 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBR, found that the full incidence of the tariff falls on domestic consumers. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York calculated that the earlier, much smaller tariffs cost the average American household over $800 a year. Now, imagine that applied across the board at a 16.3% clip. We're not talking about a rounding error in the CPI. We're talking about a structural, persistent inflationary force that makes everything, from your iPhone to your running shoes to the screws holding your desk together, more expensive. In a world where the Fed has just spent 3 years wrestling 2022-era inflation back into its cage, this is like pouring gasoline on a smoldering fire. The retaliation hurricane: do we really need to learn this lesson again? The world will not simply accept this. They will retaliate, precisely and painfully. China will once again target American soybeans, gutting the agricultural heartland. The European Union will slap 25% tariffs on Harley-Davidsons, Kentucky bourbon, and Levi's jeans. Canada and Mexico, our biggest trading partners, will hit critical components for the auto and manufacturing sectors. In 2024, U.S. goods and services exports totaled nearly $3.2 trillion, supporting millions of jobs. A full-blown, Supreme Court-blessed trade war puts a giant bullseye on every single one of those dollars. The result? American exporters get crushed, farmers go bankrupt, again, requiring more multi-billion-dollar government bailouts, and export-dependent jobs vanish. Supply chain Armageddon. For the last 40 years, the global economy has been built on the principle of efficiency. Companies built hyper-optimized, just-in-time supply chains that span the globe. While the pandemic and geopolitical tensions have started to unwind this, a permanent, high-tariff world throws a wrench into the entire machine. A CEO at a major electronics firm can no longer plan 5 years ahead. Will a key component from Vietnam suddenly face a 50% Liberation Day tariff? Will a semi-finished good from Mexico be reclassified and taxed into oblivion? This uncertainty is poison. It forces companies to undertake the monumentally expensive and time-consuming task of reshoring or friendshoring their supply chains, leading to years of disruption and higher costs that, you guessed it, are passed on to you. Layer 2, the tectonic shift, cracks in the global financial foundation. This is where the professionals in the audience should be paying close attention. This isn't just about the price of a t-shirt. This is about the fundamental plumbing of the global financial system. The weaponization of everything. When the President of the United States can impose tariffs on any country, at any time, for any declared emergency, trade is no longer about economics. It becomes a primary tool of coercive foreign policy. The message to the world becomes, align with us on every issue, military, political, and economic, or we will unilaterally cripple your economy. This hyper-weaponization of trade policy forces every other nation to do two things: 1. Build their own economic fortresses, leading to a fragmented world of competing trade blocs, and 2. Desperately search for an alternative to the US-led financial system. The acceleration of de-dollarization. Follow the money, bosses. The US dollar's status as the world's reserve currency is the ultimate exorbitant privilege. It allows us to borrow cheaply and exert immense financial power. But this privilege rests on trust and predictability. When US economic policy can be upended overnight by a single executive decision rubber-stamped by the Supreme Court, that trust erodes. Countries are already spooked by the freezing of Russia's dollar reserves. This tariff case would be the nail in the coffin. Nations like China, India, Brazil, and even traditional allies in Europe will accelerate their efforts to trade in local currencies. Look at the data. The IMF's COFR data for Q2 2025 will likely show the dollar's share of global reserves continuing its slow but steady decline from its peak of over 70% in the early 2000s. A pro-tariff ruling would pour rocket fuel on this trend. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, from China and others will be fast-tracked to create non-SWIFT, non-dollar payment rails. This is a slow-motion existential threat to American economic hegemony. The Federal Reserve's nightmare scenario. Imagine you're the Fed chair in 2026. The Supreme Court has just given the president a blank check on tariffs. The economy is now facing a massive supply shock. Prices are soaring because of the import taxes, inflationary, but at the same time, global demand for US exports is collapsing and domestic investment has frozen due to the uncertainty, recessionary. This is the dreaded beast of stagflation. What does the Fed do? Do you raise interest rates to fight the tariff-induced inflation, thereby deepening the recession and throwing millions out of work? Or do you cut rates to fight the recession, allowing inflation to spiral out of control? There is no good answer. The Fed's primary tools are rendered useless, caught in a political crossfire they cannot win. Market volatility would explode as traders realize the world's most important central bank is flying blind. Layer 3, the philosophical meltdown, rewriting the rules of the game. Finally, let's zoom all the way out. This case isn't just about dollars and cents. It's about the fundamental operating system of American capitalism and its role in the world. The imperial presidency and the death of predictability. For over 200 years, the American system has been based on a separation of powers. The messy, slow, deliberative process of Congress was a feature, not a bug. It created a stable and predictable environment where businesses could make long-term investments, knowing the rules wouldn't change on a whim. This Supreme Court case seeks to replace that system with one of executive fiat. Economic policy could become as volatile as a presidential tweet. The rule of law would be replaced by the rule of one man. This is the kind of institutional decay that makes international investors pull their capital and park it in more stable jurisdictions like Switzerland or Singapore. It fundamentally increases the risk premium for investing in America. The final rejection of the post-World War II order. Since 1945, the United States has been the primary architect and beneficiary of a global, rules-based trading system, GATT, then the WTO. This system, for all its flaws, created the most prosperous era in human history. It was based on the principles of non-discrimination and predictable, low tariffs. Trump's legal argument is a stick of dynamite tossed into the foundations of that order. It implicitly states that international agreements and institutions like the WTO are irrelevant. The only thing that matters is the unilateral declaration of an emergency by the US president. This signals to the world that America is no longer interested in leading the global system it created, it is only interested in dominating it through raw power. The long-term result? A chaotic, might makes right world that is poorer, more volatile, and more dangerous for everyone, including the United States. So, what does this all mean for you, the aspiring mogul, the savvy investor, the concerned citizen? This Supreme Court case is far more than a partisan squabble. It is a referendum on the future of the American economy. A ruling in favor of the administration would be the single most disruptive economic event of the decade. It would unleash a toxic cocktail of inflation, retaliation, and uncertainty domestically, while fundamentally undermining America's position in the global financial order. It would be a Pyrrhic victory, gaining a powerful domestic political tool at the cost of long-term prosperity and stability. Conversely, a defeat for Trump would be a massive, multi-trillion-dollar market event. The 16.3% tariff rate would be slashed in half, providing a powerful disinflationary tailwind. Tens of billions in refunded tariffs would flow back to businesses. Global supply chains would breathe a collective sigh of relief. It would be a powerful reaffirmation of the separation of powers and the rule of law. The stakes could not be higher. The Supreme Court is being asked to decide whether the United States will remain a predictable, market-based economy governed by law, or whether it will become an unpredictable, state-directed economy governed by the whims of one individual. Don't let the legal jargon fool you. Follow the money. All trillions of it are hanging in the balance. Stay sharp, bosses. Don't just make money, understand the game.